All right, welcome back, everybody. This is our last week, so I want to say first that this whole semester I really, really enjoyed reading your work, both the creative work that you've done, your thoughts in discussion boards and on readings, and the way that you've engaged like really deeply with the subject matter of the course. It's been great, like seeing how you've opened up and just the kind of creative energy that you put into everything that you've done here. For this last week, I've given you something to read that is probably one of the most interesting things I've come across in the last couple of years. This is some excerpts from Sarah Manguso's Ongoingness. Let me just share my screen real quick. So this is Ongoingness, the end of a diary, which felt like oddly appropriate for sort of finishing off a course on memoir writing. And what you're going to find pretty quickly is that this is by a woman who has dealt her whole life with a condition called hypergraphia, which basically means that she has this compulsion to write, like a compulsion to record. So she's kept like an 800,000 word like diary since she was a teenager. And the diary itself, she's very specific, is not what you're getting here. Rather, what you're getting is her thoughts on why she did it. She writes at one point that basically she has felt like if she stopped writing in her diary, she might as well be dead. And naturally, I don't have this condition, but the idea is really fascinating to me. And where it gets even more interesting, and probably why I enjoyed finding this a couple of years ago, is what happens when she finally does sort of find herself like stopping writing, which happens when she basically when she becomes a mother. The really most brilliant passages that I'm giving you in this, and some things that I think that people in this class, or a few of you, are going to be able to really relate to, are what happens when like entire days and weeks and months of her life start to go by in like her postpartum period, where she doesn't write because like A, she doesn't have the energy to write, but B, she also can't really think of anything, that she can process well enough to write about, like due to sleep deprivation and lack of energy. Because basically her whole days are monotonous and sleep deprived because they're filled with just like feeding an infant and only sleeping when the infant sleeps, which is very irregular, and changing diapers and just a whole lot of like effectively nothing. And so during this time, she says that she feels less like a person in the world than she more just feels like sort of a static world in and of itself, like, a world that another person is sort of existing in and existing through. And this idea that she's getting at here, I think, is that being a person, like being an active and engaged and dynamic person, goes hand in hand with the act of narrating, with the act of storytelling, of recording that's, transforming like raw events and memory into story and meaning. That's really intriguing to me because I've in the past run across theorists who actually wrote almost the exact opposite. Someone who I've wrestled with, at times in my life is a feminist theorist named Susan Sontag, who she wrote a set of essays on photography, which was cleverly titled On Photography, that basically wrote that taking photographs, she was writing this like back in the I think 70s or 80s, back when it was sort of the an earlier era where everyone suddenly was toting around, cameras, long before cell phones, long before social media, but when everyone was starting to take pictures of everything all the time. And she wrote that this habit we were developing of taking photographs was making us voyeuristic, and she even wrote disengaged and disconnected from our own experience and from the world around us. She said basically that like if we're obsessed with like taking the pictures of recording things, then we're not really living. She said that basically you can either be a person acting in the world or that you can be a person recording the world, but you couldn't be both. She found those things to be opposites. And we've touched on that a little bit earlier in the course, actually, with the question of whether the intention of writing about something, about an experience, would pollute the experience itself. We talked about that a little bit in our travel writing unit. But she also wrote about just like she had a lot of like powerful phrases, like she would describe like the mnemonic violence, she said, of photography as something that happens when we rely on pictures, on what we've recorded to remember things as opposed to just relying on our own minds and our own memories. And I guess we kind of touched on this too when we talked about social media and the use of social media as a memory tool. Now, she was writing this obviously like a long time before everyone was carrying on a phone. And so this was long before like the age of selfies, which she definitely also would have absolutely hated because she also wrote that trying to understand ourselves through photographs is essentially pathetic. I remember that phrase. So I could say, we can agree to disagree, but she's dead now, so I win automatically, that's a mean thing to say. She actually wrote some other smart things too, and also some of the really dumb things. But I think that why I disagree with this so strongly is that I feel that when I'm writing, or for that matter, when I'm taking photographs, when I'm trying to capture something about the world and my experience of it, I actually think I'm a lot more engaged, and I think I'm a lot more active in the world. I think that this act of storytelling, that this act of narration makes me more a part of the world and not less of a part of it. Now, I'll admit that my own life experience here definitely probably shapes my feelings about that a little bit. It makes me a little bit biased because, for me, I've always felt that when I started self-narrating, when I shifted from being a fiction writer to a creative nonfiction writer, was really kind of hand in hand with when I feel that I started existing. Like I've mentioned in the past that I'm a transgender person, and more specifically than that, I'm an old transgender person, which means I grew up in the 80s, and that meant growing up in a world without like any acknowledgement that people like me existed. And or at least certainly nothing would have been available to me, as a young child. Because back then, transgender identity, or they would have just said transsexualism, was really only recognized like a medical diagnosis. It was a sickness. It was something that was wrong with people. It was an illness, like a mental illness that your doctor had to prescribe you treatment for. Naturally, obviously, it's a funny kind of like mental illness in that there are no, or sickness in general, and that there's no physical symptoms of it whatsoever. So the only thing really to look for is your story. Like the story of your own life and how you tell it becomes the indication that you are this kind of person. Now, over time, that evolved a lot. Like the idea of trans identity as a mental illness has changed and evolved and shifted from there, thankfully, and, both in the medical field and outside of it. But that didn't just happen on its own. Like it happened because, directly as a result of people like me, sharing their real stories. The stories that showed their authentic selves to the world. And in some ways, the world itself, we could say, is really, really different now. More people understand that transgender people exist, that it's not an illness, even though there's obviously still broad swaths of the population that are very committed to the belief that trans people are somehow like fundamentally unreal. And that's why on an individual level, if not a broad cultural level, a lot of young people who are in the same position that I once was, still find themselves in this, faced with this need to tell a story, to tell their own story, to express themselves in such a way that will convince their audiences maybe not being like, broad, audiences of publication, but audiences being their friends, their family, their coworkers, of who they are, even when, their audience's own eyes, at least like through the lens of, a culture that says our bodies define who we are and that sex and gender are the same thing, tells them something else. And so my point in all this is that narrating, recording, reflecting, I don't think is the opposite of acting in the world. I think that those things are an action that we take in the world. I think that creating nonfiction is not just about expressing what's real, but it's actually about determining and shaping what everyone can understand to be real. And maybe that's why these borders that we've talked about so many times in this course between the real and the unreal and that hazy space of subjectivity in between are so interesting to me because it isn't really about tricking your audience into believing something that isn't true. Rather, it's about giving them this gift of the ability to see something that is true that they've been taught their entire lives is impossible. And that's something that I think is very profound and very, very powerful. Now, I know that some people in this class, for one reason or another, some for the same reason as me, and some for others, understand exactly what I'm talking about. That this already probably makes sense to you, and it isn't only trans identity that this applies to. There's all kinds of real life experiences that people in power would prefer to pretend are fictional, would prefer to regard as invalid or consider unreal. Now, for those of you who don't understand it, or at least don't understand this firsthand, I really hope, I very much hope that you never find yourself in this position where your own real life existence is considered in some way implausible. That your life and yourself are in some way not real. I hope essentially that you never find yourself faced with the need to sort of narrate yourself off of the fiction shelf and into the real world and then as a result maybe change what the entire world recognizes as real and not real. But at the same time, if you ever needed to, I hope you think it's kind of cool to realize that you could. So I am probably not going to say anything smarter than that, so I'm just going to take this opportunity to say one more time, thank you so much for your engagement in the course and happy writing.